What's poppin', Busters? It's me, MT, and welcome back to the Heavy Spoiler Show, y'all. And I've got a question. Does bustin' make you feel good? I know it does for me, and that's why I decided to do a breakdown of the first Ghostbusters movie from 1984. So, let's make like the Ghostbusters and break this monster of a movie on down, shall we? Ghostbusters was directed by Ivan Reitman and released in theaters on June 8th, 1984, the very same day as the first Gremlins film. Ivan Reitman had a crazy time restraint when it came to producing Ghostbusters, as Columbia Pictures only gave him and his crew 14 months to do so, with the production running from May 1983 to June 1984. And as many people already know, Ghostbusters is the brainchild of Raymond Stantz actor Dan Aykroyd, who has been obsessed with the supernatural ever since he was a kid, primarily because of his family. I mean, his grandparents were oftentimes known to hold spiritual seances, his mother claimed that she encountered a ghost while nursing a baby Dan Aykroyd, and his father has been put into trances by mediums in the past. Even Dan Aykroyd himself swears by having seen green tubes of glowing ectoplasm with a friend one night, which is kind of wild. So, growing up with a spiritually aware family that routinely hunted for the paranormal naturally inspired Dan Aykroyd to write a movie as a love letter to all things ghosts, while also making sure that the techniques that the Ghostbusters used in the movie to capture ghosts were accurate to the techniques that real-life paranormal investigators use. And when Aykroyd first started writing the script, the film was initially going to be centered around two main characters played by both himself and his close buddy, John Belushi, Aykroyd's Saturday Night Live colleague who he starred alongside in the 1980 Blues Brothers movie. Aykroyd's original vision for his Ghostbusters universe was significantly larger in scale than what we actually ended up getting, as Aykroyd originally envisioned his movie to take place in the not-too-far future of 2012 that had Ghostbusters as part of that society's emergency services, busting ghosts as often as firemen put out fires. But these Ghostbusters were not just busting ghosts on planet Earth, but also on other planets and dimensional planes entirely. However, this original script had a number of problems that made it unworkable. While the script was filled with all sorts of non-stop action, Dan Aykroyd's nerdy ass went a little bit too hard with the paranormal science jargon in the dialogue. Dialogue that Aykroyd himself claimed that only an acceleration physicist would enjoy. Because of the complexity of his dialogue, combined with the fact that the sheer scale of what he wanted to produce was going to cost around $300 million to make into a reality, Harold Ramis was brought on board in order to help Aykroyd make a film that was both cheaper and accessible to the average audience member. The Ghostbusters film would ultimately cost about $25 to $30 million for Columbia Pictures to make. The movie only needed $80 million just to break even, but fortunately, Ghostbusters went on to gross $225 million, becoming the most successful comedy of the time by 1984, and crushing Indiana Jones and Gremlins at the box office. And much like how Ghostbusters crushed it at the box office, you could be crushing it at the work office in some Heavy Spoilers merch from heavyspoilers.shop. We've got a new Grid Racer shirt inspired by the Neutron Ares movie, a fun chainsaw shirt for fans of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre film, as well as two incredible shirts inspired by Gen V and the boys. We've got all that and so much more over at the store, so hit up heavyspoilers.shop today. It's a great way to support the channel. But what's funny about the initial Ghostbusters mania is how the Ghostbusters box office numbers would do extremely well in pretty much every American city except for the very city that the movie takes place in, because of how disruptive the filming of Ghostbusters was to New York traffic. When it came time for the movie to debut in theaters, the people of New York were already so fed up with all things Ghostbusters that they initially boycotted the film, choosing to support the first Gremlins movie instead. However, over time, once people found out how amazing the movie was, the people of New York would pull a 180 and regard the film as a New York City classic. So much so that New Yorkers would rally together to prevent New York City from closing the firehouse that the production used for the exterior shots of Ghostbusters HQ. The movie begins with the exterior of the Stephen A. Schwarzman building of the New York Public Library, located at 476 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. And as the camera pans down the front of the library, it stops before one of the lion statues that have stood outside of the Stephen A. Schwarzman building since 1911. Made out of Tennessee marble, the two lion statues are actually named patience, and fortitude. Names made up by former New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia during the Great Depression in order to inspire New Yorkers going through tough financial times. And throughout history, the placing of stone lions outside of buildings were to act as symbols of protection. So it's fitting that this movie starts off with a famous New York City symbol of protection like this, considering that the Ghostbusters themselves would also become famous symbols of protection by movie's end. We then meet a librarian named Alice, a character undoubtedly named after her actress, Alice Drummond. In one of the earlier versions of the script, this librarian was actually supposed to be around her late 20s, but they decided to age the character up to a woman in her mid-50s. And as the librarian walks through the aisles, she doesn't notice the paranormal activity happening behind her in the form of books floating through the air, an effect achieved by hanging books on super thin wires and pulling them across the frame. And Alice does not get hip to the haunting until some nearby drawers open up and start shooting out a bunch of cards, with that effect being achieved by placing a few crew members behind a fake wall so they can push open drawers and blow air through some tubes to trigger the chaos. And being freaked the hell out, Alice turns into both a runner and a track star and tries to run away from the mayhem, only to come face to face with the librarian ghost herself, causing Alice to let out a scream. Actress Alice Drummond actually credited her screaming abilities for why she got the role as a librarian in the first place, which I can definitely believe considering that this scream is what accompanies the Ghostbusters title logo as it appears on screen. And this is when we hear Ray Parker Jr.'s iconic Ghostbusters theme for the first time, with Ray Parker Jr. himself actually coining the "who you gonna call" catchphrase with these very lyrics. Apparently, Ray Parker Jr. spent a full 2 days absolutely struggling trying to create the Ghostbusters theme. And during his struggle, a random TV commercial for a drain company came his way, and that commercial inspired him to include the words, "who you gonna call?" However, Ray Parker Jr. and the Ghostbusters production would end up getting sued by the band Huey Lewis and the News, because they felt like the melody of the Ghostbusters theme song was a blatant ripoff of their 1983 song, "I Want a New Drug." And to their credit, their assumptions were not all that off. Not only did the Ghostbusters production ask Huey Lewis and the News to make a theme for their movie before they hired Ray Parker Jr., but apparently they also actually did play that very song on the Ghostbusters set as a placeholder while Ray Parker Jr. was working on the Ghostbusters theme. So that song was a major influence on the creation of the Ghostbusters theme song, and Huey Lewis and the News would actually get a huge chunk of change because of that. But this would not be the only lawsuit that the Ghostbusters production had to deal with, because remember Casper the Friendly Ghost? You know, that dweeby dead kid that was friends with Hilary Duff that one time? Well, those early Casper comic books had a ghost character in it named Fatso, who sort of looks like the famous Ghostbusters mascot inside of their logo a little bit. This similarity would move Harvey Comics, the producer of the Casper the Friendly Ghost comics, to try to get a nice little payday from the Ghostbusters production for stealing their shit. However, unfortunately for them, they would end up losing their case because the judge said, and I quote, "Shut the hell up, Harvey Comics, that's just what ghosts be looking like and shit." End quote. I'm just kidding, but that would be hilarious if they did say that. But anyways, as the Ghostbusters logo appears on the screen, it rests on top of the Alma Mater statue, located at the Lowe Memorial Library at Columbia University. And while Columbia University is indeed a real university, the Weaver Hall where Venkman, Stantz, and Spengler worked at does not exist at all. The exterior shots of Weaver Hall are actually of Columbia University's Havemeyer Hall, a hall that was prominently featured in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy. Peter Parker and Harry Osborn are walking to this very building when Peter first learns that Harry's father, Norman, is a bit of a scientist himself. But yeah, when we head inside of Weaver Hall, we see the front door to the Paranormal Studies Laboratory. And on the door, we can see that an angry woman has written the words, "Venkman burn in hell" in red lipstick, immediately establishing Bill Murray's Peter Venkman as a womanizer who likes to hump 'em, pump 'em, and dump 'em with zero respect for their feelings. This lipstick message was originally going to say something a lot more raunchy and rude, but they decided on the whole burn in hell thing in order to make the movie more family friendly. And as you can probably already tell, Ghostbusters was written for a much older audience in mind. I mean, it's not really hard to see considering the movie's plethora of adult jokes and smoking and whatnot. It would not be until after the movie came out in theaters that the production realized that kids were really into this new team of ghost-bustin' dudes. So naturally, the movie's 1989 sequel ended up being a lot more sanitized and kid-friendly, especially since a lot of children began falling in love with the 1986 Ghostbusters animated series called The Real Ghostbusters. So making an adult-oriented sequel was completely out of the question at that point. But yeah, all the filming for these Columbia University college scenes were actually filmed on location at Columbia University, with the university allowing them to do so long as Columbia University was never outright mentioned at any point during the film. The production also figured that filming indoors inside of the college was a lot more convenient anyway, because it allowed them to not have to think about weather conditions and shit. Inside the office, we find Bill Murray's Peter Venkman conducting a sham of an experiment on two young college students, continuously shocking the male student volunteer for incorrectly guessing the images on what appears to be giant playing cards. And while this particular experiment in the movie is completely bogus and made to try to get Peter laid, Peter Venkman's experiment actually combines two real-world experiments into one. Specifically the Rhine and Milgram experiments. The Rhine experiments, conducted by J.B. Rhine in the 1930s, aimed to test extrasensory perception, also known as ESP. They were basically looking for signs of telepathy or clairvoyance, specifically by using simple methods like guessing symbols on special cards with shapes and stars on them called Zener cards. And much like we see in this scene, the participants of that experiment would attempt to read the cards without seeing them, while Ryan analyzed whether their guesses beat actual chance, which would, in Ryan's opinion, suggest psychic abilities. The Milgram experiments, on the other hand, were a series of experiments run by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s, and these tests explored obedience to authority, where participants were told to give electric shocks to a learner for wrong answers, with those shocks increasing in intensity over time. However, the participants had no idea that the person that they were shocking wasn't actually being shocked at all, but was only pretending to be shocked in order to see how many participants would comply despite believing it was wrong to do, with the goal of revealing how people follow orders under pressure. And the shock box that we see Venkman use in this scene isn't actually a shock box at all, but instead an old Beckman pH meter, one of the first machines designed to measure the acidity levels of liquids and whatnot. This scene of Venkman constantly zapping this poor male student was apparently one of Bill Murray's favorites to film in the entire movie. But speaking of Bill Murray, before he was cast as Venkman, a number of other actors were considered for the character, including Michael Keaton, Steve Guttenberg, and Chevy Chase, who would all end up rejecting the opportunity. And while Steve Guttenberg would actually end up saying no to Ghostbusters in order to star as Cadet Carrie Mahoney in 1984's Police Academy, Chevy Chase would end up opting out primarily because he did not like how comedic the script ended up evolving into in comparison to the early versions of the movie that he read. Robin Williams and Tom Hanks were also names the production were throwing around for Peter Venkman as well. I would have loved to see Robin Williams as Peter Venkman. That would have been kind of funny. And unlike all the other actors for Ghostbusters, Bill Murray was the only one that was not under any sort of contract. Murray's involvement in the movie was purely a verbal agreement between him, Ivan Reitman, and Columbia Pictures. Murray only agreed to do Ghostbusters if Columbia promised to put money into a passion project of his, a remake of the 1946 film The Razor's Edge, based on the 1944 novel of the same name. Bill Murray's The Razor's Edge would come out the very same year as Ghostbusters in 1984, but would be met with mixed to negative reviews. But yeah, Peter's flirtatious experiment is interrupted with the sudden arrival of his colleague, Ray Stantz, played by Ghostbusters creator Dan Aykroyd, like I mentioned earlier. And when Ray enters the room, he walks by a pinup of Marilyn Monroe, undoubtedly put up by professional woman appreciator Peter Venkman. Ray excitedly tells Venkman that a bunch of people at the New York Public Library shit their pants at the sight of a ghost, and how their colleague Egon Spengler was already there scanning the PKE valences in the area, with PKE standing for psychokinetic energy. Psychokinetic energy is a term used in ghost-related stories to describe the invisible energy that ghosts or spirits supposedly give off or use to interact with the physical world. It's essentially ghost power that lets ghosts move objects, create cold spots, or be detected by special equipment. It's definitely a fictional/paranormal concept that has not been proven by science at all. The two of them soon arrive at the New York Public Library and meet up with their buddy Egon Spengler in the Rose main reading room. And Egon actor Harold Ramis has noted in the past how the name of his character was a mashup of two real-life people, a foreign exchange student from his high school days named Egon Donsbach, as well as the German mathematician, philosopher, and historian Oswald Spengler. And before script co-writer Harold Ramis would decide that he was the perfect person to play the character Egon, Michael Keaton would also be offered the role himself, much like he was offered the role of Peter Venkman. The trio then soon interviewed the traumatized librarian Alice, and when Venkman asks her about her family's mental health history, Alice responds by claiming that her uncle believed that he was Saint Jerome, a figure in Catholicism known for being the patron saint of librarians. So it seems like being a librarian runs strong in Alice's family. So maybe there's a chance that this librarian ghost was linked to Alice's line. Who knows? The group then head to the basement of the New York Public Library, a location that wasn't actually filmed in New York whatsoever, but at the Los Angeles Central Library in California. This is primarily because the New York Public Library only allowed them to film inside the building until 10 a.m., so they kind of had no choice but to find a new library. That kind of reminds me of the weird filming restrictions that the production for Jumper had when they tried to film at the Coliseum. You guys can discover all about that in my Jumper breakdown here on the Heavy Spoilers channel. The device in Egon's hand as they walk through the aisles is called a PKE meter, or psychokinetic energy meter. It's also called an oroscope in other Ghostbusters media. And originally, the production envisioned this device to look a lot more like your average metal detector, but they opted for this pre-designed sci-fi prop instead.
These were not made for Ghostbusters. These were made by Modern Props, run by John Zabricki, and they were just a generic sci-fi prop that had movement capability and lights that fit the bill of the script and became iconic because of its use in Ghostbusters, even though it was in other films.
Egon's PKE meter leads him to a strange tower of books that the library ghost created, and Ray mentions that similar paranormal symmetrical book stacking was seen during a supernatural event known as the Philadelphia Mass Turbulence of 1947. And while this event never really happened in real life, and there isn't much about this specific event in the Ghostbusters universe, its name was different in one of the earlier scripts of the movie, originally referred to as the Manse Turbulence. In that earlier script, the Manse Turbulence was described as a sighting of ghostly phenomena like symmetrical book stacking, ghostly apparitions, and strange ectofluid, like the kind Venkman is disgusted at finding in the library. Director Ivan Reitman actually included this book stacking element at the last minute, with the idea popping into his brain while on his way to work that day. The trio then eventually come face to face with the library ghost herself, played by actress Ruth Oliver. And while this apparition is primarily known as the library ghost, she's also been given the name Eleanor Twitty in other non-canon Ghostbusters media, like the Ghostbusters comics published by IDW, as well as Ghostbusters the video game from 2009. Ray and Egon, being the brave souls that they are, convince Venkman to make first contact with the ghost. And as he says hello, check out how the library ghost flips the page of the book in her hand. Like, she doesn't pinch the page at all, but has the page magically float to the direction of her hand, almost like she was using the Force from Star Wars. This effect was achieved by the VFX team having actress Ruth Oliver act in reverse, then reversing those movements in post, which is quite clever. Then after Venkman is shushed by the ghost, the three of them try to jump the intangible ghost together. And this famously causes the librarian to scare the ectoplasm out of all three of them when her face morphs into a monstrous form. This scary-ass transformation was originally going to be a lot scarier, but the puppet that they created would not end up being used in the film. However, the unused puppet would get a new chance to shine in the 1985 horror film Fright Night. After all three of them run for their lives, Egon analyzes the data that he collected and comes to the conclusion that they could theoretically find a way to capture all these ghosts with technology. And when Venkman asks how serious he is about this, Egon replies by saying that he's always serious. Harold Ramis took this part of Egon's personality very seriously, so much so that he made a conscious effort to make sure that Egon rarely ever smiles. Ramis did this to underscore his character's brainy nature. However, this would be the only Ghostbusters movie where Harold Ramis would choose to do this for the character, as he would smile a lot more in the sequel. I mean, he kinda had to at that point due to Ghostbusters' popularity with the kiddos. However, none of the three of them would be smiling for long when they arrived back to their offices to find that they've lost all of their university funding due to the lack of significant scientific findings, as well as Peter Venkman's fraudulent nature. And while they're having their stuff taken away from their office, we can see one of the workers carting away this strange looking orange piece of equipment here. This is actually a MedRad Mark IV angiographic injector system. An angiographic injector is a medical device that precisely and forcefully injects a special dye into a patient's bloodstream to make their blood vessels visible on x-rays. So this being in the Ghostbusters office implies that Ray and Egon have been injecting various subjects or themselves with God knows what in order to gather supernatural data. And as Peter and Ray lick their wounds outside of Columbia University by drinking some Hiram Walker apricot-flavored brandy in public, Peter comes up with the brilliant idea to go into business for themselves, before convincing Ray to sell his parents' home in order to secure the money needed for their ghost containment devices. They would also buy themselves a fancy new building, which used to be a local firehouse. The exterior of the building is actually the Hook and Ladder Company 8 firehouse, located at 14 North Moore Street in Manhattan. Built in 1903, this firehouse has been used for 100 plus years, with the firefighters stationed there actually being among the first on scene during 9/11. And because of this, as well as the station's massive popularity following the release of Ghostbusters, New York City decided to save the firehouse from closing after they initially planned to do so in 2011. But this firehouse was only used for exterior shots. The interior shots were actually filmed at the decommissioned Fire Station number 23 in downtown Los Angeles, the former headquarters of the entire LA Fire Department. The station was originally built in 1910 and would operate for 50 years when it was decommissioned in 1960. And with the station being unused, various movie productions have decided to film there, including 1985's Police Academy 2, 1996's Set It Off, and 1994's The Mask. And Ray's excitement about the fire pole inside of the abandoned firehouse was genuine, as sliding down the pole was not actually originally in the script at all. Dan Aykroyd demanded that the pole be used in the movie because he thought it was super fun. And soon after this, we get a shot of the Shandor building, the apartment building of Miss Dana Barrett. This building is actually a mishmash of two buildings together. The base of the building is a real New York City building located at 55 Central Park West, but the top of the building itself was modeled off of the Continental Life building located in St. Louis, Missouri. We are then introduced to Dana Barrett, played by Sigourney Weaver, as she walks into her apartment carrying a load of groceries. And when going after the role of Dana Barrett, Sigourney Weaver actually auditioned alongside the likes of Denise Crosby, Kelly LeBrock, Daryl Hannah, and a very young Julia Roberts, with Julia Roberts' age being the primary reasons why she wasn't cast, as she was about 16 to 17 years old at the time. And when crafting the character of Dana Barrett, screenwriters Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis considered making her an alien from outer space outright, before toning things down a bit and considering making her a supermodel or a famous Hollywood actress. But when they actually got around to casting Sigourney Weaver in the role, it would be Sigourney herself who would recommend that her character be a musician. And as Dana makes her way to her apartment, she runs into her thirsty-ass neighbor, Louis Tully, played by the great Rick Moranis. And before Moranis got the role, actors Edward Deason and John Candy were also both considered, along with late-night talk show host Jay Leno, which would have been a terrible decision. John Candy would actually straight up be offered the role before turning it down due to creative differences. Candy wanted the Louis Tully character to be radically different from Ivan Reitman's vision, straight up wanting him to have a thick German accent and own two schnauzers. But the production wasn't trying to go for all that. Dana then enters her apartment, leaving Louis by himself. And as Louis walks back to his locked apartment, we can hear audio from the 1937 film Lost Horizon blaring in the background from a TV. But on Dana's TV specifically, we are shown a commercial for the Ghostbusters business. A commercial that the Ghostbusters release with a 555 phone number. And with this movie commercial in mind, the production decided to recreate it for real life. But instead of a 555 number, they actually created a 1-800 number that people could actually call in when they saw it on TV. So over the first few weeks of Ghostbusters' peak popularity, that number would apparently get called an average of 1,000 times a day, which is nuts. And what's also nuts is how the Ghostbusters production did not actually know what the Ghostbusters team was going to be called while they were filming the movie. I mean, while they wanted to use the name Ghostbusters outright, apparently they were legally unsure they could do so because of the existence of a 1975 TV show called The Ghostbusters. So because of this, the production had to shoot multiple takes of every scene that featured the name of the team, swapping the name of the company with other alternatives like Ghost Stoppers, Ghost Breakers, and Ghost Blasters.
Ghost Stoppers! Ghost Blasters!
They repeatedly did this over the course of production until it got so annoying that Ivan Reitman begged Columbia Pictures to get the Ghostbusters name cleared as soon as possible. And fortunately for all of them, they made it happen. An earlier version of the script portrayed the Ghostbusters team as low-paid workers with no real technical skill, essentially janitors for hire. Harold Ramis thought that this actually weakened the story because he believed that characters are at their best when they are actively choosing their path rather than being trapped by circumstance. So to address this, he and Aykroyd reimagined the Ghostbusters as self-motivated professionals whose decision to pursue the paranormal gave the film stronger dramatic and comedic push. And as Dana puts her groceries away, her carton of eggs suddenly pops open before the eggs start cooking themselves next to a bag of Stay Puft Marshmallows, with the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man being pictured on the packaging. Dan Aykroyd purposely made the design of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man to be a mashup of the Pillsbury Doughboy and the Michelin Man, mainly because he wanted the marshmallow mascot to be as recognizable as possible. And before deciding to use this shot of the bag of marshmallows near the exploding eggs, the production originally intended to introduce the Stay Puft Marshmallow brand through a stop-motion animated television commercial that was set to play right after the Ghostbusters commercial on Dana's TV. But Reitman felt like the shot of the marshmallows in the bag was simple and effective enough. And of course, Dana freaks out at the detonating dozen of eggs before opening her fridge to find a portal to the Gozerian dimension. But she would not get to stare into the strange dimension for long when she is jump scared by the terror dog Zuul. And a super fun fact about Zuul in this movie is how Zuul actually inspired the name of a species of dinosaur in real life. Apparently, some archaeologists found the remains of a dinosaur that looked a lot like the terror dogs from Ghostbusters. So because of that, the dinosaur was given the name Zookurovastator, after the terror dog Zuul. And those fossils can be seen at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Canada. And soon after this, we see Ray pull up in a 1959 Miller Meteor Cadillac, a car that used to be used as an ambulance for injured patients or a hearse for those poor souls that didn't quite make it. The production actually purchased 2 of these Cadillac Miller Meteors, one for this initial reveal scene and another for when the Ghostbusters finish customizing it. And while the car looks pretty shitty on the outside when Ray rolls up in it, don't worry, it's even more shittier on the inside. Because according to pretty much everyone on set, the Ecto-1 would constantly break down randomly without fail. The Ecto-1 was originally going to be painted all black after the transformation until it was pointed out that the car would be hard to see during the night scenes. The siren sound that the Ecto-1 makes is actually a significantly edited and repitched sound of a leopard's growl, which is kind of wild. Like, I truly do not understand how Foley artists come up with these weird-ass inspirations for sounds, but they always end up working out, so whatever. Anyways, the movie then introduces us to Ghostbusters secretary Janine Melnitz, played by actress Annie Potts. We can see the musician Cher on the cover of a January 23rd, 1984 copy of People magazine that Janine is reading when we first see her. And although the role of Janine feels like it was made for actress Annie Potts, she wasn't actually originally offered the role. The production would actually approach actress Sandra Bernhard first, but she would turn down the role due to not wanting to fall into the cliche of being yet another female character serving a bunch of dudes. Which is definitely a fair thing for her to do, of course, but good God, does she fumble the bag hard, not gonna lie. And after Venkman tells Janine to make busy, Egon pops up from under Janine's desk, to which Janine says that he's good with his hands. Yet another indication how this movie wasn't originally intended for younger audiences.
Because of the implication.
But speaking of Janine and Egon, those two were initially supposed to have a bit of a thing for each other before most of their flirting scenes were taken out. Their relationship gets a lot more play in the real Ghostbusters cartoon series, but the roots of that relationship have their origins in deleted scenes like these.
I want you to take this.
What is it?
It's a souvenir from the World's Fair at Flushing Meadow in 1964. It's my lucky coin.
I shouldn't take it. We might not be coming back.
Take it anyway. I got another one at home.
Janine, didn't your mama ever tell you not to get involved with no Ghostbuster? Now go on home. Be gone.
The Ghostbusters soon get a visit from Dana Barrett herself, causing Peter to leap into action at the prospect of getting some action. And when he goes to meet Dana, he jumps over a wooden railing, but as he does, you can hear and see his feet hit the railing itself. Ivan Reitman and Harold Ramis both believe that if Bill Murray did not manage to make that jump, that fall would have most likely killed him, which is kind of wild. And after explaining her story, Dana is then hooked up to a machine so the Ghostbusters can record her vital signs. The instruments that they use to do so are a Space Labs 701 patient monitor, which sits on top of an old school Chromaco System 1 CS1H computer. The Chromaco System 1 CS1H was a compact microcomputer from the late 1970s designed for hobbyists, engineers, and small businesses. It's one of the first ever personal computers that let users customize their setup with plug-in cards and peripherals. And after the Ghostbusters determine that Dana believes in her own wild interdimensional fridge story, Peter the Creep insists on inspecting Dana's apartment in order to keep flirting with her and maybe get lucky. And when he arrives, he pretends to annoy the ghost nearby by playing random notes on Dana's piano.
I hate this. I like to torture him.
A few short moments later, when Peter is checking out Dana's fridge for a portal, Ghostbusters composer Elmer Bernstein harkens back to that same piano melody, which is fun.
Oh my God.
The ghost-busting device that Peter whips out in Dana's apartment is actually called a ghost sniffer, but is actually just a cleverly repurposed Bacharach 300 series gas leak sniffer from United Technologies. And after finding nothing but cold food in the fridge, Peter eventually makes his way back to Dana's couch, where we can see a sculpture of a hand placed behind his right shoulder, a foreboding piece of cinematography that symbolically foreshadows the supernatural hand that would grab onto Dana a little bit later on in the film. But in order to impress Dana enough to go out with him, Peter promises to personally solve the riddle of her paranormal activity for her. Then we shift back to Ghostbusters HQ, where the Ghostbusters are eating dinner when they get their first official ghost-busting call. And as the team scrambles to get ready, we can see a few arcade machines in the background. From left to right, we have the Missile Command arcade game, followed by the Star Castle arcade game in the middle, and a Stargazer pinball machine at the very end on the right. And if you guys enjoy arcade games and films from the 80s, be sure to check out my breakdown of the original Tron film that we did over here on Heavy Spoilers. But yeah, all of those machines in the Ghostbusters HQ were released just 4 years prior to the film in 1980. Then the song Cleaning Up the Town by the Bus Boys plays as the team gears up to head to the Sedgewick Hotel. Most of the shots of the Sedgewick Hotel were actually filmed at Los Angeles' Biltmore Hotel on the other side of the country. And wearing their massive proton packs, they meet up with the manager of the hotel, played by actor Michael Ensign, who accepted this part after being rejected for the role of Walter Peck, which would ultimately go to actor William Atherton. The proton packs that the Ghostbusters wear on their backs were extremely heavy, something that Bill Murray was not exactly a huge fan of. But I personally like the weight that these proton packs give to the Ghostbusters because it makes the equipment feel more real and believable, like they were proper exterminators wearing a bunch of dangerously high-tech machinery on their backs. But instead of a rifle-like gun device, the proton packs were actually originally going to be attached to wands with tiny spheres at the end called neutrino wands, much like we see here in the early storyboards. These wands were linked to the proton pack on the back by thick black cables, and strapped to each wrist, they extended along the hand to about 6 inches past the fingers, and a switch on the backpack triggered them, releasing bright red and green beams of light. So the Ghostbusters almost looked a lot more like Harry Potter, which is kind of wild to think about. And after walking through the hotel hallways a bit, they run into the lovable green ghost that we all know as Slimer. Slimer is never actually given a name at any point in Ghostbusters 1. It would not be until a few years later in 1986 that the Ghostbusters cartoon, The Real Ghostbusters, would officially give this goofy-ass green ghost a name that was primarily based off of Venkman's reaction after getting slimed by him.
He slimed me.
And because this name wasn't made until years later, over the course of production, Slimer was primarily referred to as Onion Head, pointing to Slimer's gross, pungent nature. And getting the look down for Slimer was a bit of a stressful task for production artist Steve Johnson, as the director, producers, and art directors all had their own opinions as to what this ghost should look like. And after a good amount of trial and error, the production ultimately decided to model Slimer's face off of the late John Belushi, an actor that was originally meant to be in the movie before he suddenly passed away from an overdose of illegal substances. And like I mentioned earlier, when Dan Aykroyd was first writing the film, the character of Peter Venkman was specifically written for him. The mannerisms of Slimer himself in this movie were apparently modeled after John Belushi's character Bluto in 1978's Animal House. So because of that, the cast and crew of the movie either referred to Slimer as the ghost of John Belushi or just plain Onion Head. Slimer's voice was also provided by director Ivan Reitman himself, which is quite fun. And in order to bring Slimer to life, the production created a foam latex puppet costume that a man could fit in. On-set puppeteer Mark Wilson would throw the Slimer costume on while wearing a black suit underneath against a black background so that his physical body would not be seen when they keyed him out in post. But yeah, after Venkman gets slimed, Ray and Egon get excited about studying the ectoplasm that was left behind. And in order to create this slime for the movie, the production used a fine textured thickener called methylcellulose ether, a fine plant-derived substance that thickens or gels liquids. It's commonly used in food, cosmetics, and construction to improve the texture and stability in products like sauces, lotion, and drywall. This slime, like all the special effects of this film, were courtesy of Boss Film Studios, a VFX studio that Columbia and MGM founded specifically to do VFX on Ghostbusters. Mostly because the artists over at Industrial Light and Magic had their plates mega full with George Lucas's Star Wars and Indiana Jones projects. Richard Edlund, a former employee at Industrial Light and Magic, would convince Columbia to found the company, and Boss Film Studios would later work on movies like Big Trouble in Little China, Batman Returns, and Die Hard. But anyways, the Ghostbusters soon follow Slimer to the dining area where Slimer can be seen flying around a chandelier, a shot that director Ivan Reitman has gone on record to say is his least favorite effect produced for the movie. But after the Ghostbusters cause untold amounts of property damage to the hotel dining area, they all manage to secure that slippery Slimer into one of their ghost traps. And with their first victory freshly under their belts, Peter Venkman then says the words, "We came, we saw, we kicked its ass," which is a clear reference to the iconic "I came, I saw, I conquered" by Julius Caesar. Then we get a montage of the Ghostbusters growing in popularity, one that starts with a news report from former ABC News anchor Roger Grimsby. We then see a USA Today front page dated October 9th, 1984, which prominently features a Ghostbusters article titled "Ghost Fever Grips New York." And to the left of this article is a section detailing other bits of news. Like how, for example, in Washington, the Interior Department is deciding on oil drilling in California, while Jane Fonda is leading protests against President Reagan's Central America policies. We also see that Ed Meese faces more questions about his finances, with Ed Meese, of course, having had an influential role in shaping conservative policies during the 1980s by being the close advisor to President Ronald Reagan before becoming U.S. Attorney General himself. And there's also an article about the passing of actor William Powell, who famously starred in 1934's mystery comedy The Thin Man, which is also referenced in the article. But what's a bit odd about this mention of William Powell's death in this article is how William Powell would have been dead for a full 7 months before this October USA Today paper, as William Powell died on March 5th, 1984 in real life. We then see a New York Post article dated October 23rd, 1964, with the headline, "Ghost Cops Bust Chinatown Spook." But what's funny about this headline is how it prominently features an image of Egon, Venkman, and Ray fighting Gozer at the very end of the film, which has not happened yet. So there's a bit of a continuity error there. And to the left of their article is a side article talking about how 5 hospital staff members were charged after allegedly marking terminally ill patients for fatal overdoses in what they called mercy killings, prompting a major investigation and suspensions. Kinda heavy stuff. Soon after this, we see the Ghostbusters on the cover of Time magazine, along with a cameo from famous talk show host Larry King. And on the top right corner of the magazine next to the fold is an image of designer Michael C. Gross, the man who made the Ghostbusters famous No Ghost logo featuring the Ghostbusters ghost mascot. whose name is actually Moogly, according to Dan Aykroyd. We then see October covers for both Omni Magazine and The Atlantic, with The Atlantic cover questioning whether the ghosts that the Ghostbusters capture have civil rights, which is honestly a really interesting thing to think about because some of the ghosts in the Ghostbusters universe still have their mental faculties about them. Then we hear the voice of famous radio host Casey Kasem, a voice extremely familiar to those who grew up listening to him in the 80s. Other than radio work, Casey Kasem is also famous for being the first man to ever play Shaggy in a Scooby-Doo cartoon. Casey Kasem's wife, Jean Kasem, also stars in Ghostbusters as the tall blonde woman in pink at Lewis's party later on. And as Dana watches the Ghostbusters mania unfold in her apartment, we can see Ray Stantz talking to Joe Franklin on the famous talk show, The Joe Franklin Show. And this is before we see another major headline from the tabloid The Globe, which has the late Princess Diana at the top with the headline, "Princess Di Expecting Again." And even though this headline was fake and made for the movie, this would ultimately be proven to be correct when Princess Diana would become pregnant with Prince Harry, who would also be born that very same year in 1984. More on that article a little bit later. And at the bottom of the Globe front page are the words, "Glennie's Innermost Secrets," with Glennie being the name of the wife of Ghostbusters associate producer Michael C. Gross, who I mentioned earlier as being the creator of the Ghostbusters logo. Then we learn just how much Bustin makes Ray feel good when we get a weird moment of Ray receiving some supernatural sloppy toppy from somebody's dead grandma. And even though this moment was depicted to be a dream in the movie, it wasn't originally supposed to be a dream at all. Apparently, when this scene was initially filmed, the idea was that Ray would be visited by this female ghost after the Ghostbusters decide to sleep over inside of an old abandoned fort. So when that element was removed from the script, that scene was drastically shortened to be a quick moment during this Ray Parker Jr. montage. But after the montage, we are finally introduced to the fourth Ghostbuster, Winston Zeddemore, played by the absolute legend Ernie Hudson. In a 2015 Entertainment Weekly article, Ernie Hudson expressed mixed feelings about his Ghostbusters role as Winston Zeddemore, loving the film and its cast, but feeling frustrated that his character was just kind of there with a reduced presence, despite fans cherishing Winston's great lines. Originally, Ernie Hudson was excited for a much larger role, with an early 1983 script of the movie depicting Winston as an Air Force demolitions expert with a rich backstory, leading him to accept the part for half of his usual salary. And a big reason why Ernie Hudson was cast in the movie in the first place was due to comedian Eddie Murphy not being available to play the part as it was originally written, with Eddie Murphy choosing to star in the 1984 movie Beverly Hills Cop instead, which ended up being a fantastic career choice for him. So because Ernie Hudson was not Eddie Murphy, the night before shooting began, director Ivan Reitman handed Hudson a new script with Winston's role significantly cut down. And another big motivator behind Ernie Hudson's reduced presence in the film was Columbia Pictures' decision to highlight Bill Murray's Peter Venkman in order to take advantage of Murray's growing popularity from films like Stripes from 1981. And because of this, Ernie Hudson felt super disrespected and had a weird love-hate relationship for the Ghostbusters property for the longest time. However, in another universe, Family Matters actor Reginald VelJohnson could have been playing the character of Winston Zeddemore, because it almost happened in this universe. But even though he wouldn't get the role, the production still found a place for him in the movie as a prison guard. But anyways, after a super short interview, Winston is hired to join the Ghostbusters. Then we transition to Peter meeting back up with Dana at the Lincoln Center for Performing Arts, where Dana has just performed herself. And this is actually the very first scene that these two actors film with one another for the movie. And it's a scene that features flags at half-mast in the background. This is because on October 23rd, 1983, 2 truck bombs exploded in Beirut, Lebanon, targeting American and French military barracks. And the attacks killed 241 American and 58 French troops, along with some civilians, and were linked to militant groups during Lebanon's civil war. So in remembrance of those lost, President Reagan would have the flags lowered for several days. There, Peter gives Dana the lowdown on the ghostly god Gozer, who was apparently openly worshipped by the Sumerians around 6000 BCE. Dan Aykroyd came up with the name Gozer because of 2 primary sources. During Aykroyd's work commute, he would regularly drive by a car dealership called Gozer Chevrolet, a name that he always thought sounded super cool and paranormal. The second reason is tied to a real-life claim of ghost activity that unfolded in the late 1970s in Enfield, London, an event that would become famously known as the Enfield poltergeist case. Apparently, a single mother and her 4 children claimed their home was haunted by a violent supernatural force, and most of these strange activities centered around Janet, age 11, and Margaret, age 13, who said furniture moved by itself, objects flew across rooms, and knocking sounds echoed throughout the house. But amongst all the weird phenomena, the name Gozer was apparently written all over the walls of the home, which would also lead Aykroyd to using the name for his Ghostbusters villain. This Enfield poltergeist case attracted crazy media attention, with reporters, police officers, and paranormal researchers visiting the house to witness the events for themselves. And it became one of Britain's most publicized hauntings, sparking nationwide debate over whether the girls were truly experiencing something supernatural or just making shit up for attention. This event also influenced how the public and media approached supposed paranormal cases in the years afterwards. But anyways, back at Ghostbusters HQ, the boys get a visit from Environmental Protection Agency Inspector Walter Peck, played by William Atherton. And as Mr. Peck grills Peter about their potentially hazardous operations, we can see another Globe article on Peter's wall above this lamp with the headline, "Triplets for the Princess," pointing to how Princess Diana gave birth to triplets in this universe instead of just Prince Harry. And after Peter tells Walter Peck to get the Walter Heck out of Ghostbusters HQ until he has a warrant, the movie cuts to Egon explaining how the increased PKE levels across the city are an indicator of an oncoming danger on the horizon, specifically by using a Twinkie. This Twinkie bit was added by Harold Ramis because he thought the general audience would benefit from a physical metaphor for the amount of energy building up in New York City. But meanwhile, on top of Dana's apartment building, Gozer's loyal minion Zuul comes to life by hatching from one of the building's stone gargoyles. And this happens just before Dana enters her apartment and plops on the couch, an action that triggers a nearby door to start glowing in the background. Director Ivan Reitman took inspiration from the 1977 sci-fi thriller Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which has similar lighting techniques used in order to indicate the presence of an otherworldly entity. And after Dana gets yoinked by Zuul, we then transition to her neighbor Louis Tully, who's having a party in his apartment. And I love Rick Moranis' performance in this scene in particular, especially after I learned that most of it was just Rick Moranis improvising it all. And that's pretty much how it went down in the entire Ghostbusters production, as most of the scenes of the film had some serious ad-libbing and improvisation from the actors, in particular with actor Bill Murray, who was pretty much non-stop with the improv. But Tully would not get to enjoy his lame party for long until he's attacked by Gozer's other loyal lapdog, Vince Clortho. He eventually finds his way to a restaurant where he bangs on the glass to get someone to help him. The interior of this restaurant is actually the former Tavern on the Green restaurant located on the corner of Central Park West and 67th Street. And as Louis is being attacked by the terror dog outside, a birthday girl inside the restaurant at a table of balloons turns around to look at him. This girl is actually singer and actress Debbie Gibson in her first ever film role, which is pretty cool. After merging with Vince Clortho, Louis eventually gets his weird ass arrested and brought to the Ghostbusters. Meanwhile, Peter heads to Dana's apartment to pick her up for their date, but finds that Sigourney Weaver has become Sighorny Weaver now that she's got that dog in her. And thinking that Peter is the keymaster, Zuul the gatekeeper attempts to have Dana bump uglies with Peter in bed, which eventually leads Zuul to creepily make Dana levitate in bed. This moment of Dana floating in midair was actually achieved 100% practically with the help of no post-production special effects whatsoever. Director Ivan Reitman was inspired to do this in large part to illusionist Doug Henning, who the director worked with in a Broadway production of Merlin. And while the two worked together on that show, Doug Henning managed to achieve this very same illusion on the stage. So Reitman thought it was the right time to flex that technique again for his movie. To achieve this effect, Sigourney Weaver was placed inside of a full body cast before being connected to a surface hidden behind the bedroom curtains. And much like he did with Slimer, Ivan Reitman would also provide the demonic voice that comes out of Dana during this moment as well. Dude has a great voice. But yeah, freaked the hell out, Peter then calls his Ghostbusters homies and tells them how much of a freak his date just was in bed. And before Peter heads back to HQ, he leaves Dana panting like a dog in her bed. And speaking of dogs, acting like a dog is actually how Sigourney Weaver landed the role as Dana Barrett in the first place, surprising Reitman during her audition by suddenly jumping on a couch and fully committing to acting like a dog. Sigourney Weaver actually agreed to do Ghostbusters primarily because it was an opportunity for her to prevent herself from being typecasted as this actress that only does super serious roles, as Sigourney Weaver's career was being propelled at the time in large part to her iconic performance in the original 1979 Alien film. She really wanted to flex her comedic acting abilities that she honed while she was a student at Yale Drama School. So when she heard that a bunch of funny people were involved in this wacky, out there project, she jumped at the opportunity to be a part of it all. But yeah, the movie then cuts to Ray and Winston driving on the Manhattan Bridge as they compare the rise of ghost activity in New York to the biblical end of days. Ray then brings up Revelation 7:12 before Winston appears to quote that very Bible verse right after.
I remember Revelation 7:12. And I looked as he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became as black as sackcloth, and the moon became as blood.
The seas boiled and the skies fell.
Judgment Day.
Judgment Day.
This moment is actually a mistake on the part of Dan Aykroyd, as the verse that they actually quote is found in Revelations chapter 6, verse 12, rather than chapter 7. And after watching my videos for a while, you guys can definitely tell that I grew up in a very religious Haitian household. Like, if my Haitian mom ever found out that I did a breakdown on a movie about ghosts, she would call me up and be like, "Oh, MT, why you watch that zombie movie? You want to preach the devil to the people? You are coming with me to Legley's this Sunday." Legley's means church, by the way, in Creole. I went to a lot of Legley's against my will. Anyways, after this, the Ghostbusters then get a visit from EPA asshat Walter Peck, who now has a warrant. And because his feelings were still hurt after Peter told him off earlier in the movie, he ignores the Ghostbusters warnings and shuts down the ecto containment system. And this immediately causes the system to overload and explode, releasing all of the ghosts throughout of New York City and causing dust and debris to rain on all the bystanders outside. And amongst these bystanders is someone that your grandfather or father might be very familiar with, as this guy all the way to the left of the frame here is none other than actor Ron Jeremy behind this police barrier. I mean, he wasn't an actor in the traditional sense. You know what? Just ask your dad what kind of acting he did. Or just look through those boxes that your dad put in the attic. I ain't trying to get this video demonetized, okay? But instead of using the Ghostbusters to wrangle all the ghosts back to their cages, Walter Peck has the Ghostbusters imprisoned instead, like an idiot. And while the Ghostbusters are in prison, Ray and Egon tell the others how Dana's building was designed by a cult leader named Ivo Shandor, who, after witnessing the horrors that humanity unleashed in World War I, wanted to use the design of Dana's building to act as a supernatural doorway for Gozer to bring about a supernatural apocalypse.
And he wasn't alone. He had close to 1,000 followers when he died. They conducted rituals up on the roof. Bizarre rituals intended to bring about the end of the world. And now it looks like it may actually happen.
So be good. For goodness sake. Whoa, somebody's
We
coming.
have to get out of here.
And Peter lightening the mood by singing Santa Claus is Coming to Town seems to be a reference to Bill Murray's famous SNL character, Nick Winters, the lounge singer, a character that would oftentimes randomly break into song.
Star Wars, nothing but Star Wars.
The character of Ivo Shandor was actually going to be the main villain of the entire movie instead of Gozer, which honestly would have made a lot more sense considering how his actions caused all the mayhem in this movie. But we would not canonically see what Ivo Shandor looked like until 2021's Ghostbusters Afterlife, where we learned that this dude looks a lot like an old-ass J.K. Simmons. But what's especially weird about this jail scene is how this filming location freaked out just about everyone on set. The crew literally thought that the set was haunted, including director Ivan Reitman, who absolutely dreaded the thought of having to shoot reshoots there. And a big reason for their fear is because the actual film that they shot on at that location had mysterious scratches all over it for some reason. Scratches that Reitman and his crew thought were supernaturally strange. But the Ghostbusters don't spend too much time in prison before they are summoned by Mayor Lenny, played by actor David Margulies. Walter Peck tries to dissuade the mayor from using the Ghostbusters to solve the New York City ghost problem, claiming that it was the Ghostbusters themselves that caused this issue in the first place.
Everything was fine with our system until the power grid was shut off by Dickless here.
They caused an explosion.
Is this true?
Yes, it's true. This man has no dick.
Walter Peck being called dickless in this movie would be a line that would haunt actor William Atherton for pretty much the rest of his career. One time, Atherton complained to Reitman about how a bunch of little kids yelled "Hey dickless" at him from a school bus while he was just minding his own damn business, which is hilarious. Seeing nothing to lose, the mayor then decides to give the Ghostbusters a chance to handle the paranormal chaos happening at the Shandor apartment building. And as the Ghostbusters arrive, they're greeted with the cheers of countless pedestrians in the streets. And like I mentioned earlier, the traffic that scenes like this produced was a nightmare for all the New Yorkers around the area during production. So much so that the Ghostbusters would get chewed out by legendary writer Isaac Asimov, the original creator of the I, Robot anthology series. Dude was literally just nearby, just being inconvenienced by all this shooting. And I actually talk all about Isaac Asimov in my I, Robot breakdown that you guys can check out here on Heavy Spoilers after you subscribe. Subscribe today. But yeah, wearing their proton packs, the team then slowly ascend up the countless stairs of the building before coming face to face with Gozer themselves, played by Yugoslavian actress Slavica Jovan. And while Jovan plays Gozer's physical form, it would be British actress Patty Edwards that would provide Gozer's voice, as the production felt like Jovan's strong Yugoslavian accent made Gozer appear less menacing for some reason. Gozer's appearance was designed by the Ghostbusters team to be a mashup of the singers Grace Jones and David Bowie. And before Jovan got the part, Gozer was originally offered to Pee Wee Herman actor Paul Rubens. But in addition to Paul Rubens, actress and artist Anne Carlisle would also reject the opportunity to play Gozer when offered. And in my opinion, I feel like she honestly would have been a fantastic choice as the genderless ghost Gozer, as she previously played both a man and a woman in the 1982 film Liquid Sky. Gozer then instructs the Ghostbusters to choose the form of their destroyer in their minds. And even though 3 of them tried their best to empty their minds, it would be Ray's hungry-ass head that would cause Gozer's destroyer to take the form of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. This final scene with the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man freaked out Ivan Reitman and the producers a whole lot. I mean, not because it was scary, but mostly because they were afraid that the audience would reject the Marshmallow Man for being way too much of a random, goofy-ass thing. And because of this, they were super close to coming with a whole new ending entirely that didn't feature the iconic monster at all. But luckily, the audiences at an early screening of the film loved the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man so much that they decided to take the risk. And because it was much too complicated for the production to shoot in their super short time frame, a shot of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man emerging out of the New York harbor next to the Statue of Liberty was cut from the film, which is a huge bummer because I feel like it would have been a great shout out to the classic cinematic titan Godzilla, who also emerged from the ocean to wreak havoc on a major city. The production was actually heavily considering giving Gozer 2 transformations during this scene, transforming first into the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man before transforming into a less comedic and far more scarier monster. But they of course ultimately decided against that. And after failing to stop the giant marshmallow titan with their particle throwers, they all decide to risk it all by pointing the big guns at Gozer's temple itself and combining the powers of their proton streams. But instead of the universe exploding out of existence like Egon originally thought, the cross streams were enough to trigger an explosion that destroys both Gozer's temple and Gozer's marshmallow menace. An explosion of marshmallow then begins to rain on the people below, with a massive chunk falling on Walter Peck like he deserves. And this was actually around 30 pounds of shaving cream, which is kind of nuts. But what's even crazier is how the production was about to drop twice as much onto William Atherton's head. But after they absolutely crushed one of their stunt guys under 75 pounds of shaving cream, they would choose to spare William's life by using half the amount. But yeah, pretty much everyone in the vicinity gets a blast of marshmallow on them, with Venkman having the least out of everyone due to Bill Murray not wanting all that shit on his body, which is kind of funny. It's very Bill Murray. And Ivan Reitman originally did not intend on having the Ghostbusters save the day by crossing their streams at all, and actually decided that ending on the fly while shooting this rooftop scene. And I'm glad that he did, because I cannot imagine this classic movie ending any other way. But anyways, that is it for this breakdown of the original Ghostbusters film. What do you guys think of the film? Let us know in the comment section down below. But like always, you guys can follow me at Mastertainment on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, YouTube, wherever I am on the internet. But most importantly, follow Heavy Spoilers here on YouTube by hitting the subscribe button, and maybe even hitting that like button if you guys enjoyed the video. But like always, I've been MT, you guys have been amazing, and I'll catch you Ghostbusters later. Bye.